Your mother a violinist, your father in the law. Was it inevitable that you would fall into law yourself?
Oh, that was given. It was the crisis, if there was a crisis, was at the end of my 2 years of arts before going to the Faculty of Law. I'd become very interested in classical archaeology, and that was a serious alternative career. But I think at that time it was just so offbeat or off the beaten track. It was such a departure from a given and set plan that it couldn't be seriously contemplated. But it is something, in fact, to which I've returned now that I've retired and have more time to read it and participate occasionally in events at the University of Sydney.
You, of course, nevertheless found many outlets for your artistic and history interests over the years anyway, so I suppose that did provide a satisfactory sideline. But going back to the study of law, and yes, you did arts law at the Sydney University. I was alluding a moment ago to the Oz trials, and one of your fellow students at the time was, of course, the very, very well-known Geoffrey Robertson QC, who later was to brief John Mortimer in the Oz trials. Mm. Were you close to him at the university?
For 1 year, Geoffrey Robertson was president of the Students' Law Society, and I was secretary. At the end of that 1 year, Geoffrey Robertson chose to be president again, and I chose not to be secretary, and that will end my discussion of Geoffrey Robertson.
Fair enough. While you were studying law, in those days there weren't that many women doing law, but do you recall any fellow students, women lawyer students?
I do recall that there were, I think, about 3 or 4. Of course, the years were made up of several hundred students, and with at least one I have kept up to date in the sense that we bump into each other in the street every now and again. Neither their presence nor their absence had an impact one way or the other, frankly. We were busy being article clerks. Those who had done arts beforehand, of course, had the benefit of mixing with a far higher level of female students.
You mentioned in a speech that the Sydney University Law School in those days was a rather revolting environment, and I take it you mean where it used to reside in Phillip Street?
It was dreadful. It was physically revolting, dirty, old, and quite counter-conducive, as far as I was concerned, to intellectual endeavour. In fact, I loathed law school. I can say that. I loathed it. I enjoyed being an articled law clerk, which took you out on the streets and you had coffee with all your contemporaries, but to have to go to that dump and be taught mainly by teachers who used the same method that was probably used for 100 years beforehand was profoundly depressing. And if I learnt any law, I learnt it after law school. I learnt it with discussions with my father, who was always approachable, of course, and you learn it on your feet. The teachers, I think, were successful to the extent of instilling in that generation of undergraduates that peculiar thing called legal reasoning, which is not reasoning at all in my view, but it's necessary. But there was only one teacher that I can recall, Professor David Benjafield, who was in a wheelchair, and he had the amazing skill to make property law interesting, and I thought that was a great triumph. Whereas my arts lecturers, which was on the main campus, there was entirely different. They were excellent.
What about Professor Julius Stone, though? He was himself a bit of an institution in the area of jurisprudence, and I gather you did admire him. He wrote extensively.
Well, Julius Stone, I think, is still recognised as one of the great jurisprudential scholars. His books were, of course, compulsory, as was his subject then, that you had to do jurisprudence. I found his books almost incomprehensible, and the joke was that there was 3 lines of text and the balance of the page was footnotes, made up of footnotes, and they're really quite extraordinary. But I went to his lectures and I passed. And then I think jurisprudence as a pure discipline has disappeared out of my life. But he was one of those. He'd walk up and down with his long scarf, and I think he smoked a pipe as well at the time. Yeah.
It's interesting you speak in the way that you do about the academics you had to endure. Some of the other barristers and counsel that I've interviewed spoke with some affection of lecturers they had post the war years, but they said that many of those lecturers had actually had the advantage of practising and weren't therefore quite so academic as presumably the people you had to encounter.
Well, I can only think of 2 lecturers who were practitioners, Roddy Marr and Theo Simos. Theo Simos, with respect, was, in my view, the better teacher. Roddy Marr was just this extraordinary intellect who was quite overwhelming. They are the only 2 practitioners. I think there was also a Mr. Barr. He was a property solicitor with the old firm of Dawson Waldron. And he was okay, that I can remember. But otherwise, they were academics. That's how I viewed them.